The carriage had been waiting for 17 minutes. Margot Thorne knew because she had counted every one of them, standing in the drizzling rain outside Lady Cordelia's townhouse with her worn valise growing heavier in her grip. The hired carriage she'd scraped together funds to rent for the afternoon sat motionless in the middle of Brook Street, blocking the narrow lane while its occupant remained inside, apparently unconcerned that the entire thoroughfare had ground to a halt behind him. 3 carriages now, 4, a delivery wagon whose driver was shouting increasingly creative profanities into the grey London afternoon. Margot's fingers tightened on her valise handle. She had exactly 1 hour to reach the Foundling Hospital on the other side of Mayfair, deliver the medical supplies Lady Cordelia had donated, and return before her employer's evening salon began. 1 hour that was rapidly dissolving, while some arrogant fool sat in his carriage reading correspondence, or admiring his own reflection, or whatever it was that men with that much brass on their doors did with their time. The rain intensified. Water seeped through the worn sole of her left boot. "Excuse me?" Margot stepped into the street, approaching the gleaming black carriage with its ridiculous gold embellishments. She rapped firmly on the door. "Excuse me, sir. You're blocking the entire street." No response. She knocked harder. "Sir, there are a dozen vehicles waiting. If you could please—" The door swung open with such suddenness that Margot stumbled back. A man emerged, tall and dark-haired, his greatcoat so perfectly tailored it probably cost more than she earned in 6 months. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her existence at all. He simply stood there in the rain, continuing to read a letter, as if she were nothing more than another piece of London debris cluttering his periphery. Something hot and familiar coiled in Margot's chest. The same feeling she got every time Lady Cordelia's guests looked through her while discussing the servant problem. Every time a shopkeeper followed her with suspicious eyes while ladies in silk browsed freely. Every time someone assumed that because her dress was 3 years out of fashion and her father had died in debtor's prison, she could simply be ignored. "I beg your pardon," Margot said, her voice sharper now. "But you cannot simply stand here reading your correspondence while the entire street waits for your convenience." He glanced up. His eyes were grey, cold as the rain, and held precisely the expression she'd expected, mild irritation that she'd dared to speak. "The street will wait," he said simply, and returned to his letter. The hot coil in Margot's chest ignited. "The street will wait?" She heard her voice rising, heard the decades of swallowed frustration bleeding through her carefully maintained governess composure, and found she didn't care. "The street will wait because you've decided your time is worth more than everyone else's, because you believe the entire city should simply pause while you— What? Finish reading news from your tailor? Your club?" Now she had his full attention. He lowered the letter slowly, his expression shifting from irritation to something approaching disbelief. "I beg your pardon?" "No." Margot stepped closer, rain streaming down her face, her valise abandoned on the cobblestones. "No, you don't get to say that. You don't get to act shocked that someone finally told you the truth. Look around you." She gestured at the growing line of stalled vehicles, the gathering crowd of onlookers. "There are people trying to work, trying to live their lives. But you've decided that none of that matters because you're— What? Important? Powerful?" His jaw tightened. "You have no idea." "I have every idea," Margot cut him off. "I know exactly what you are. You're a man who's been told his entire life that the world exists for his convenience, that rules about consideration and basic human decency don't apply to you, that people like me—" Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. "People like me are invisible until we dare to speak, and then we're simply inconvenient." The street had gone silent. Even the delivery wagon driver had stopped cursing. Margot could feel dozens of eyes on her, could practically hear the collective indrawn breath of witnesses to her social suicide. Governess rails at gentlemen in Mayfair. The gossip would reach Lady Cordelia before Margot made it back to the townhouse. She didn't care. Let them talk, let them whisper. She was so desperately tired of being invisible. The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, not warmly, not kindly, but with a sort of dangerous amusement that made Margot's stomach drop. "You believe I think myself above basic decency," he said quietly. "You believe I consider you invisible. I don't believe it, I know it. I've seen it in every man like you I've ever encountered. Men like me." He stepped closer, and Margot forced herself not to retreat. "Tell me, what exactly do you know about men like me? I know you've never gone hungry, never worried about whether your employer would keep you another month, never stood in the rain wondering if you could afford to hire a carriage or if you'd have to walk 3 miles carrying supplies because spending those coins meant not eating tomorrow." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition. But before he could respond, a voice called out from the crowd, Your Grace, the Home Secretary is waiting." The words hit Margot like cold water. Your Grace. Grace, the honorific for a... No. Oh God, she breathed, the colour draining from her face. The man's dangerous smile widened. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said, and his voice carried across the silent street. "Callum Ravenswood, Duke of Greymont." The world tilted. Margot felt every eye on the street boring into her, felt the weight of what she'd just done settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She just publicly berated one of the most powerful men in England, called him arrogant and inconsiderate and essentially useless to his face in front of dozens of witnesses. She was ruined, absolutely, completely ruined. Her voice failed. She tried again. "Your Grace, I didn't..." "Didn't what?" He tilted his head, studying her with those cold grey eyes. "Didn't mean it, or didn't realize who I was?" Margot's throat closed, because the terrible truth was that she had meant it. Every word. She'd meant it with her entire exhausted, frustrated, invisible soul. "Both," she managed. "Neither. You what, miss?" He waited, and she realized with horror that he was actually expecting her to give him her name, to complete this catastrophe by providing him with the exact information he'd need to destroy whatever remained of her life. But Margot Thorne had never been good at self-preservation. It was, her father used to say, with a mixture of pride and despair, both her greatest strength and her fatal flaw. "Thorne!" she said, lifting her chin even as her hands trembled. "Margot Thorne, and I apologize for my rudeness, Your Grace, but not for my point. You were blocking the street, regardless of your title or your importance. That was inconsiderate." The crowd gasped. Someone laughed nervously. The Duke of Greymont simply stared at her, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Inconsiderate," he repeated softly. Then, to her complete bewilderment, he turned to his driver. "Move the carriage. Park it properly." The driver scrambled to obey, and within moments, the gleaming black carriage was tucked against the curb. The traffic began moving again immediately, the delivery wagon driver offering Margot a cheerful salute as he passed. Margot stood frozen, rain dripping from her hair, her ruined boots squelching with every breath, waiting for the axe to fall. For the Duke to call a constable, to demand her arrest for public insolence, to destroy her with a single word to Lady Cordelia. Instead, he picked up her abandoned valise. "You mentioned the Foundling Hospital," he said, as if the last 5 minutes hadn't happened, as if she hadn't just committed social suicide in the middle of Brook Street. "I'm heading in that direction. I'll give you a ride." It wasn't an offer. It was a command dressed in courtesy's clothing, and Margot knew with sudden terrible certainty that refusing would only make everything worse. "That's not necessary, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, opening the carriage door, "but I insist. After you, Miss Thorne." She climbed into the carriage because she had no choice, because men like him always won, because this was how the world worked. But as she settled onto the velvet seat across from the Duke of Greymont, watching him arrange himself with casual, terrifying grace, Margot felt something shift inside her chest. Fear. Yes, absolutely fear. But underneath it, burning steady and quiet, the first ember of something that felt dangerously like defiance. Margot had learned about invisibility early, not the metaphorical kind, though she'd mastered that too. The real kind. The kind where you stood in a room full of people and literally no one saw you because you were a child, and children, especially daughters of struggling physicians who couldn't afford the right schools or the right clothes, simply didn't register in certain circles. Her father, Dr. Edmund Thorne, had tried. God, he'd tried. Built a practice in a decent part of London, took on wealthy clients, invested in a small townhouse he couldn't afford because location mattered, reputation mattered, appearance mattered. He'd wanted to give Margot the life her mother had died trying to provide. The schools, the connections, the chance to marry well and never know hunger. Instead, he'd given her debt, desperation, and the particular education that came from watching a good man slowly crushed by a system designed for men with inherited wealth and family names that meant something. When Edmund Thorne died, he left Margot exactly 3 things: a medical bag full of instruments she couldn't legally use, a head full of knowledge about anatomy and disease that no one wanted a woman to possess, and debts that swallowed the townhouse, the furniture, and any hope of a respectable future. She was 19, unmarried, educated just enough to be unmarriageable and not enough to be employable in any meaningful way. So she'd become invisible by choice. Took a position as governess to Lady Cordelia Ashton's ward, a position that paid barely enough to keep her fed and clothed, but came with the crucial benefit of a room in Mayfair and proximity to the world her father had died trying to access. 8 years. 8 years of teaching a sullen girl Latin and watercolors, of standing silently at the edge of Lady Cordelia's salons while playwrights and politicians debated reform they'd never actually implement, of being so perfectly invisible that she sometimes wondered if she'd disappeared entirely, and then, this afternoon, she'd stopped being invisible. She'd stopped being invisible by screaming at a duke in the middle of Brook Street, and now she sat in his carriage, trying to remember how to breathe while he watched her with those unreadable grey eyes. "The supplies," he said, nodding at her valise. "For the Foundling Hospital. What are they?" Margot's fingers tightened on the worn leather. "Medical supplies. Bandages, tinctures, some basic surgical tools. The hospital's physician is a friend of Lady Cordelia's, and she contributes when she can. But you know what they are. Specifically." It wasn't a question. Margot met his gaze. "My father was a physician." Was. "He died 7 years ago. And he taught you." Still not a question. The Duke leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "That's unusual." "My father was an unusual man. He believed education was wasted on no one, regardless of gender. And the hospital, you visit there regularly?" "When Lady Cordelia permits it, I assist Dr. Morrison with basic care. I'm not qualified to practice medicine, but I can clean wounds, prepare medicines, comfort children who are frightened." She paused. "Why are you asking me this, Your Grace?" He didn't answer immediately. The carriage rattled over cobblestones, rain drumming against the roof, and Margot watched him consider his words with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being quoted. "I'm planning a reform initiative," he finally said. Starting with the foundling hospitals and orphanages across London, the conditions are appalling, the mortality rates unconscionable, and the current system is riddled with corruption. I've been looking for someone with actual knowledge of how these institutions function, not theory, not bureaucratic reports, but real, practical understanding. Margot's stomach dropped. No. His eyebrow lifted. I haven't asked you anything yet. You're going to. And the answer is no. She straightened, trying to project a confidence she absolutely didn't feel. Your Grace, I appreciate the ride, but I have no interest in being part of whatever this is. I have a position I cannot afford to lose, a reputation I've already damaged beyond repair by shouting at you in public, and no desire whatsoever to become more visible than I already am. More visible, he repeated, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. Is that what you think happened today? That you became visible? I know what happened today. I committed social suicide and gave everyone from here to Westminster a reason to remember my name for all the wrong reasons. You told the truth. He leaned forward, and suddenly the space between them felt much smaller. You saw something wrong and you spoke. That's not suicide, Miss Thorne. That's courage. Courage is a luxury for people with nothing left to lose, Your Grace. I have a great deal left to lose. Such as my position, my room, my ability to eat regularly and keep my one pair of decent boots. Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. You cannot possibly understand what it's like to know that one mistake, one moment of visibility, could mean the difference between survival and ruin. The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd expected. You're right. I can't. I've never worried about where my next meal would come from or whether I'd have shelter tomorrow. I've never been invisible because I had to be. Then why would you possibly want my help? Because I need someone who understands what's actually at stake, someone who sees the children in those hospitals as human beings, not statistics, someone who... He paused, and something shifted in his expression. Someone who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Margot laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Your Grace, in the last hour I've called you arrogant, inconsiderate, and essentially useless. I think we've established that I'm fully capable of telling you when you're wrong. Exactly. He smiled, and this time there was no danger in it, just genuine amusement. Which is precisely why I want you involved. I don't need more yes-men telling me how brilliant my reforms are. I need someone who will tell me when I'm blocking the damn street. The carriage slowed. Through the window, Margot could see the Foundling Hospital's familiar brick facade. Their time was running out, and she needed to make a decision that could change everything. If I say yes, she said carefully, what exactly would you expect from me? Honesty, insight. Accompany me on inspections of the institutions. Help me understand what actually needs to change versus what sounds good in parliamentary speeches. He paused. And occasional reminders when my privilege is showing. That would be a full-time occupation, Your Grace. Then consider yourself employed. Margot's breath caught. I already have a position, which pays you barely enough to keep one pair of boots in acceptable condition. His eyes dropped to her feet, to the worn leather and the damp spreading from the failed sole, and Margot felt heat flood her cheeks. I'll compensate you properly for your time, enough that you won't have to choose between hiring a carriage and eating. It was too much, too sudden, too convenient. Men like the Duke of Greymont didn't simply offer employment to women who'd publicly insulted them. They didn't see value in governess with dead fathers and ruined reputations. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Why would you do this? He looked at her for a long moment, and Margot saw something in his expression that she couldn't quite name. Recognition, maybe. Or curiosity. Or possibly just the aristocratic whim of a man bored enough to find amusement in a woman who dared to shout at him. Because in 33 years, he said quietly, No one has ever spoken to me the way you did today. And I think I've been waiting my entire life for someone to tell me I'm blocking the street." The carriage stopped. The door opened. Rain continued falling on London's indifferent streets. Margot Thorne stood on the edge of the most dangerous decision of her life, looked into the grey eyes of a duke who saw her, actually saw her, and said the only thing she could say: "When do we start?" The Duke of Greymont's first reform initiative began at 7 o'clock the following morning with an inspection of St. Margaret's Orphanage in Suffolk, and Margot arrived to find that she'd severely underestimated what accompanying him on inspections would actually entail. She'd expected observation, note-taking, perhaps offering quiet insights while the Duke toured facilities with administrators who'd spent weeks preparing for his arrival. Instead, she found herself standing in a kitchen where rats nested in the flour barrels, staring at a matron who'd clearly received no advance warning whatsoever and appeared to be approximately 3 seconds away from fainting. "Your Grace," the woman stammered, dropping into a curtsy so deep she nearly toppled over. "We didn't expect me." The Duke stepped past her into the kitchen, his boots crunching on something Margot very much hoped was spilled grain. "No, that was rather the point." He turned to Margot, and she saw that same dangerous amusement from yesterday in his eyes. "Miss Thorne, would you assess the conditions here?" Every instinct screamed at her to be diplomatic, to soften her words, to consider that this matron was probably underpaid and overworked and doing her best with insufficient resources. But then she saw the rats, saw the mold creeping up the walls, saw the water damage suggesting the roof had been leaking for months, maybe years, saw all of it and thought about the children sleeping upstairs, eating food prepared in this nightmare, getting sick from conditions that would never be tolerated in Mayfair. "It's appalling," she said flatly. "The sanitation is non-existent, the ventilation inadequate, and unless I'm mistaken, that's black mold in the corner, which means respiratory illness is probably rampant among the children." The matron made a small, wounded sound. The Duke nodded. "Show me the sleeping quarters." What followed was the most uncomfortable hour of Margot's life. They inspected dormitories where 30 children slept in a space meant for 15, examined threadbare blankets that wouldn't keep anyone warm through winter, listened to the matron's increasingly desperate explanations about budget constraints and supply delays and the difficulties of maintaining a facility of this size. Through it all, the Duke remained coldly polite. He asked questions in that measured, aristocratic tone that made each inquiry feel like an indictment. He took notes in a small leather journal. He revealed absolutely nothing about what he was thinking. Margot hated it, hated watching the matron crumble, hated seeing the other staff exchange terrified glances, hated the way everyone treated the Duke's presence like a natural disaster they simply had to endure. Finally, in the 4th dormitory, she snapped. "This isn't her fault." The Duke looked up from his notes. "I beg your pardon?" "The matron, Mrs. Crawford, this isn't her fault." Margot gestured at the room, at the peeling walls and broken window frames. "She doesn't control the budget. She doesn't decide how much money this institution receives or how it's distributed. She's doing the best she can with resources that are clearly inadequate. I didn't suggest. You didn't have to. You're treating her like she's personally responsible for these conditions, when we both know the real problem is systemic." Margot felt her voice rising and couldn't stop it. The board that oversees this place probably hasn't visited in years. The men who control the funds likely have no idea what actually happens here. But you're making her feel like she's failed these children when she's probably the only thing standing between them and complete catastrophe. The room had gone silent. Mrs. Crawford stared at Margot with something approaching religious awe. The Duke's expression was completely unreadable. Then he smiled. Not the dangerous smile from yesterday. Something warmer. Almost pleased. "You're right," he said simply. "Mrs. Crawford, please forgive me. Miss Thorne is correct. This is not your failure. In fact, from what I've observed, you're doing remarkable work under impossible circumstances." The matron's eyes filled with tears. "Your Grace, I thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm going to investigate where this institution's funding is actually going, and I suspect we'll find that most of it never reaches you at all." He closed his journal. "In the meantime, I'll arrange for immediate repairs to the roof and kitchen, and I'd like you to work with Miss Thorne on a list of additional supplies you need." Mrs. Crawford nodded, still crying, and Margot felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Maybe this could actually help. Maybe she hadn't made a terrible mistake by agreeing to this. But as they left St. Margaret's and climbed back into the Duke's carriage, she caught the look on his face and realized something troubling. He'd wanted her to contradict him, had possibly even orchestrated that entire scene specifically to see if she would. "You were testing me," she said. He didn't deny it. "I needed to know if you'd tell me the truth, even when it made things uncomfortable. And you passed." He settled back against the velvet seat, studying her. "And though I must say, Miss Thorne, you have a remarkable talent for making me feel like an idiot. That's not, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize, it's refreshing." He pulled out his journal, making notes. "Tomorrow we'll visit the Hartwell Home for Girls. I've heard concerning reports about the medical care there. Given your background, I'd like your particular attention on that aspect." Margot's stomach clenched. More inspections, more visibility, more chances to say the wrong thing and remind everyone why governesses should remain silent and invisible. But also the possibility of actually changing something, of using her father's training for more than cleaning Lady Cordelia's ward's scraped knees, of mattering. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "may I ask you something, after you've spent the morning calling me an idiot? I think we're past formality, Miss Thorne. Why now? You've been Duke of Greymont for how long? 12 years. 12 years! So why suddenly decide to reform the foundling hospitals now?" His hands stilled on the journal. For a moment, Margot thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because 12 years ago, I inherited a title, wealth, and power I did nothing to earn. I've spent all that time talking about reform, giving speeches about social responsibility, writing letters to newspapers about the moral obligations of the aristocracy." His voice turned bitter. "And then yesterday, a woman stood in the rain and told me I was blocking the street, told me I thought the world existed for my convenience, and I realized she was absolutely right." "Your Grace!" "Callum!" He looked up, and Margot saw something raw in his eyes. "If we're going to work together, if you're going to keep telling me when I'm wrong, you should probably call me by my name, at least when we're alone." It was too familiar, too dangerous, too much like the kind of relationship that could destroy what remained of her reputation. "I don't think that's appropriate. Neither is shouting at dukes in public, but you seem to have mastered that." Despite herself, Margot almost smiled. "That was different. How? I didn't know you were a duke when I did it. Would it have stopped you if you had?" The honest answer was yes. Absolutely yes. She would have swallowed her frustration and waited patiently and remained perfectly invisible, because that was how you survived in a world where men like him held all the power. But looking at him now, at the way he watched her with genuine curiosity instead of aristocratic dismissal, at the journal full of notes about children no one else bothered to notice, Margot found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong about what kind of man the Duke of Greymont actually was. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'd like to think I would have been brave enough to try." His expression softened. "Then let's make a bargain, Miss Thorne. You keep being brave enough to tell me the truth, and I'll keep listening, even when, especially when, it makes me uncomfortable. And in exchange, In exchange, we fix something. We actually change these institutions instead of just talking about it. We make it so that children in places like St. Margaret's don't have to sleep 30 to a room or eat food contaminated by rats. He extended his hand. Deal. Margot looked at his outstretched hand, at the signet ring and perfect manicure, and the unearned privilege he'd acknowledged but couldn't change. Looked at it and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. How easily he could betray her trust, use her knowledge, and discard her, leave her worse off than she'd started. But she also thought about Mrs. Crawford's tears, about children who deserved better, about her father, who died believing that good people could make a difference if they were just given the chance. She shook his hand. Deal. The rumors started within 24 hours. Margot had expected gossip. Of course she'd expected gossip. A governess working alongside the Duke of Greymont on reform initiatives wasn't exactly inconspicuous. But she'd hoped the focus would be on the work itself, on the institutions they were inspecting and the changes they were trying to implement. She should have known better. Is it true? Lady Cordelia asked over breakfast 3 days after the St. Margaret's inspection, her tone carefully neutral in the way that meant she'd been fielding questions about Margot for hours. That you're accompanying the Duke of Greymont on his charitable endeavours? Margot set down her tea carefully. He requested my assistance given my background in medicine and familiarity with the foundling hospitals. It's purely professional. I'm sure it is. Lady Cordelia's ward, Beatrice, looked up from her eggs with poorly disguised delight. Though I heard from Catherine Pembridge that you spent 3 hours alone with him at the Hartwell home yesterday. She said you were seen entering a dormitory together without a chaperone. We were inspecting the medical facilities, Margot said, keeping her voice level. There were staff members present at all times. But not proper chaperones, not ladies of quality who could verify that nothing inappropriate occurred. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the particular cruelty of girls who'd never known consequence. People are talking, Miss Thorne. They're saying the Duke has taken a particular interest in you. The tea turned to ash in Margot's mouth. She'd been so focused on the work, on the children and the reforms, and the extraordinary feeling of being useful, that she'd forgotten the most important rule of being invisible. Visible women were always assumed to be improper. Let them talk, she said, more sharply than she'd intended. I have work to do. She stood, abandoning her breakfast, and heard Beatrice's delighted laughter follow her from the room. Lady Cordelia said nothing, which was, Margot knew, its own form of condemnation. By that evening, the whispers had evolved into something more concrete. Margot overheard 2 maids discussing it in hushed, excited tones while she prepared for Lady Cordelia's salon. Saw them at St. Catherine's, and he was looking at her with such intensity. No better than she should be, is she? Father died in debt, no proper family. Only a matter of time before he tires of her, and then where will she be? Margot's hands shook as she pinned her hair. She'd known this would happen. Had known the moment she accepted Callum's offer that she was trading invisibility for scrutiny, safety for the chance to matter. But knowing and experiencing were different things. And listening to servants speculate about when the Duke would tire of her, as if she were a mistress, as if the work they were doing meant nothing, felt like being flayed alive in public. The salon was worse. Lady Cordelia's guests circled like sharks who'd scented blood, their questions wrapped in silk, but cutting just the same. Miss Thorne, how fascinating that the Duke has enlisted your help. What particular expertise could you possibly offer? I suppose it's admirable that he's taking an interest in such unfortunate establishments, though one does wonder if his motivations are entirely charitable. You must be careful, my dear. A young woman in your position, well, reputation is everything, isn't it? Margot smiled and nodded, and said nothing of consequence, playing the role of grateful governess who knew her place. But inside, she felt something calcifying. The careful walls she'd built over 8 years of invisibility, the armor that had kept her safe and small and unremarkable, were cracking under the weight of all this attention. She was becoming visible in exactly the way she'd feared most, as an object of speculation, scandal, proof that women like her should never try to be more than they were. The Duke arrived just before 10, ostensibly to discuss the reform bill he was drafting with some of Lady Cordelia's political connections. He moved through the salon with easy confidence, greeting guests and discussing policy, and didn't look at Margot once. She told herself she was relieved. Told herself this was better, safer, proof that whatever the gossips thought, there was nothing inappropriate about their professional relationship. But when he finally approached her near the end of the evening, positioning himself so his back was to the room and their conversation would appear casual, she felt her carefully constructed composure crack. "You look furious," he said quietly. "I'm perfectly fine, Your Grace." Liar. He picked up a glass of wine from a passing tray, using the motion to lean slightly closer. "What happened?" "Nothing I didn't expect. The gossip is escalating. About us. About your supposed particular interest in a governess with no fortune and a dead father." Margot kept her voice low, her expression neutral. "Apparently the prevailing theory is that I've seduced you with my feminine wiles and extensive knowledge of orphanage sanitation." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "That's ridiculous." "Is it? From their perspective, what other reason could you possibly have for spending time with someone like me?" She finally met his eyes, and the bitterness she'd been swallowing all day bled through. "You're the Duke of Greymont. I'm nobody. The only narrative that makes sense to them is that I'm your mistress or aspiring to be. Then they're idiots. They're powerful idiots. The kind who can destroy my reputation with a word and face absolutely no consequences for it." Margot set down her own glass with careful precision. "Your Grace, perhaps we should reconsider this arrangement. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I cannot afford—" "No!" The word was sharp enough that 2 guests nearby glanced over. Callum smiled blandly at them, then turned back to Margot with an intensity that stole her breath. "No," he repeated, quieter now. "I understand this is difficult. I understand you're bearing a social cost I'll never fully comprehend. But we're making progress, Margot. Real progress. St. Margaret's roof is being repaired. The Hartwell home is getting new medical supplies. Mrs. Crawford told me yesterday that 3 children who would have died from infection last winter are going to survive this one because of the changes we implemented." "That's wonderful, but nothing. Those children matter more than gossip, more than propriety, more than whether some aristocratic fool thinks I've taken a mistress." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "Though if I had, I'd choose someone far more remarkable than they give me credit for." The words hung between them, loaded with implication Margot couldn't afford to examine. She should step back, should remember her place, should do everything the gossips expected and prove she knew better than to imagine. "Your Grace." "Callum, please." Callum. His name felt dangerous on her tongue. "This isn't just about gossip, it's about survival. If Lady Cordelia dismisses me because of this scandal, I have nowhere to go. No resources, no connections, no protection. You can weather this storm because you're a duke. I'll drown." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Come work for me." Margot's heart stopped. "What?" "Officially, as a consultant on my reform initiatives. I'll pay you a proper salary, provide housing, ensure you have financial security that isn't dependent on Lady Cordelia's goodwill." His eyes searched hers. "If the scandal is going to exist anyway, we might as well give it an employment contract to justify it. That would only make things worse. People would assume—" "People already assume. They've made up their minds about what we are to each other. At least this way, you'd have legal protection and compensation for the work you're already doing." It was insane. Reckless. Everything Margot had spent 8 years avoiding. Working directly for a duke, living in his household, giving the gossips exactly the ammunition they'd need to destroy her completely. But it was also freedom. Real employment, real security, the chance to do work that actually mattered without worrying whether Lady Cordelia would tire of the scandal and throw her out. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course, take the time you need." He straightened, preparing to return to the political discussion he'd ostensibly come for, but before he left, he leaned close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and rain. "For what it's worth, Margot, I think you underestimate how remarkable you are. The gossips don't matter. They never have." He walked away, leaving Margot standing alone in a room full of people who thought they knew exactly what she was. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if maybe they were wrong, if maybe she was more than just invisible, more than just a survivor, more than just the sum of her father's failures and her own careful compromises. If maybe, just maybe, she could be someone worth choosing, even if it cost her everything. Margot gave her notice to Lady Cordelia the following morning. The conversation was brief and painful. Lady Cordelia accepted with tight-lipped disappointment, Beatrice with poorly concealed glee. Neither asked where she was going or what she'd do next. Neither needed to. The gossip had already filled in those blanks with lurid, inaccurate detail. She moved into a small suite of rooms in the Duke of Greymont's townhouse. Separate wing, separate entrance, 3 locks on the door, and a housekeeper who lived next door. Callum had arranged everything with meticulous care, clearly determined to provide her with every possible protection from the scandal her presence would inevitably cause. It didn't matter. The gossip evolved from speculation to certainty within days. The Duke's mistress, they called her in whispers she wasn't supposed to hear. The governess who seduced Greymont, the beautiful nobody who'd trapped a duke. That last one was particularly galling because Margot had never been beautiful. Striking, perhaps, unusual, but not beautiful in the way society valued, not soft or delicate or appropriately feminine. She had her father's sharp features and direct gaze, her mother's stubborn jaw and practical hands. She was tall and too thin, and had never mastered the art of seeming less intelligent than she was. But the gossips needed her to be beautiful because their narrative required seduction, and seduction required beauty. So beautiful she became, in story, if not in fact. Lord Percival Lennox started attending Callum's reform meetings 3 weeks after Margot officially joined the initiative. She noticed him immediately, not because he was remarkable, but because he wasn't. Medium height, pleasant features, the kind of aristocratic blandness that came from generations of acceptable breeding. He smiled often and said little, mostly agreeing with whatever Callum suggested while taking copious notes. "Who is he?" Margot asked after the first meeting, watching Lennox chat amiably with one of the orphanage administrators. "Lord Percival Lennox. Minor title, significant wealth, sits on half the charitable boards in London." Callum shuffled through papers, not looking up. "He's been helpful in navigating the bureaucracy, has connections I lack." Something about the answer felt incomplete, but Margot let it go. She had more immediate concerns, namely, the report from St. Catherine suggesting that their recent funding increase had mysteriously disappeared before reaching the institution. "Callum, look at this." She spread the documents across his desk. St. Catherine's was allocated an additional £200 last month for building repairs, but according to their matron, they never received more than 50. He frowned, scanning the paperwork. That can't be right. The disbursement was approved and processed through the board. Then someone on the board is embezzling funds. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious problem. Margot pulled out more reports, her frustration mounting. And it's not just St. Catherine's. Look, the Hartwell Home, St. Margaret's, even the Foundling Hospital. Every institution we've inspected shows the same pattern. Money allocated, money mysteriously reduced by the time it reaches them. Callum's expression darkened. "Show me everything you have." Moke. They spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing reports, tracking fund disbursements, building a case that became more damning with every document. Someone was systematically stealing from London's most vulnerable children, and they'd been doing it for years. "We need to present this to the Oversight Board," Callum said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Demand a full audit, expose whoever's responsible. That could take months, years even. These people are powerful, and they'll fight to protect themselves." Margot hesitated. Then, what if we went public? Took the evidence to the newspapers? That would destroy any remaining credibility these institutions have. Funding would dry up completely while people debated whether the scandal was real. He shook his head. "No. We do this properly, through legal channels. It'll take time, but it's the only way to ensure lasting change." Margot wanted to argue, wanted to point out that children were dying while they followed proper procedures, that sometimes the right thing wasn't the legal thing, but she could see the determination in his eyes, the aristocratic certainty that the system could work if you just used it correctly. She'd learned not to trust that certainty, but she was beginning to trust him. "Fine," she conceded. "But we move quickly. I want this presented to the board within the week." Agreed. He started gathering documents, then paused. "Margot, this is excellent work. Truly. I don't know how you spotted the pattern when no one else did. Because I was looking." She met his gaze. "And because I understand what it's like when people steal from you under the guise of helping." Something passed between them, recognition maybe, or the beginning of understanding. Then Callum's butler knocked to announce dinner, and the moment broke. But as Margot walked to her separate wing, her mind was already racing ahead. Embezzlement on this scale required organization, required someone with access to multiple institutions, someone trusted enough to handle funds without excessive oversight. Someone like Lord Percival Lennox, who sat on half the charitable boards in London and had only shown interest in Callum's reforms after Margot started uncovering problems. She told herself she was being paranoid. Told herself there was no evidence connecting Lennox to the missing funds, that suspecting him based solely on timing and opportunity was unfair. But that night, lying in her locked room in the Duke's townhouse, Margot couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a very powerful enemy, and that the real danger was only beginning. The Oversight Board meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at Brooks's, because of course it was. Nothing said "we care about orphaned children" like hosting the discussion in a gentleman's club that explicitly excluded women. Margot wasn't invited, wasn't even mentioned in the official meeting notes, but Callum promised to present their evidence thoroughly, to demand a full investigation, to ensure that whoever was stealing from these institutions faced consequences. She tried to believe him, tried to trust that his aristocratic certainty wasn't just naivete wrapped in privilege, tried not to pace her rooms like a caged animal, while he faced down some of London's most powerful men with accusations of corruption and theft. She lasted approximately 40 minutes before giving up and going to the kitchens to help cook prepare dinner. At least kneading bread gave her hands something to do besides clench. "You're going to murder that dough," Cook observed, watching Margot attack the helpless mixture with unnecessary violence. "It's already dead. I'm just making sure." "Uh-huh. And this has nothing to do with His Grace being at that board meeting right now?" Margot kneaded harder. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't. Just like you don't know that half of London is calling you his mistress, and the other half is taking bets on when he'll marry you or ruin you, whichever comes first." "Cook, I'm just saying, girl, you're playing a dangerous game. Men like His Grace, they mean well, but they don't understand what it costs someone like you to be visible, to matter." Cook's expression softened. "I've been in service 40 years. I've seen what happens to women who believe powerful men when they say they'll protect them." The bread dough tore under Margot's hands. She stared at it, at the ruined mixture that would never rise properly now, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. He's not like that. Maybe not, but the world is. And the world doesn't care about your intentions or his promises. It only cares about appearances. Cook took the dough away gently, started fresh. "Just be careful, Miss Thorne. That's all I'm saying." Margot left the kitchen with Cook's warning echoing in her head. She'd been so focused on the work, on helping children and exposing corruption and being useful, that she'd forgotten the most important lesson her father's death had taught her. Good intentions didn't protect you when the powerful decided you were expendable. Callum returned just after 7, and Margot knew immediately that something had gone wrong. He moved differently, stiffly, like someone carrying an invisible wound, and his expression was carefully blank in the way that meant he was furious but couldn't show it. "What happened?" she asked. "They dismissed it, said the evidence was inconclusive. The accusations too serious to pursue without absolute proof." He poured himself a brandy with hands that weren't quite steady. "They suggested I was being manipulated by, and I quote, a woman with dubious motives and no understanding of institutional finance." Margot's chest tightened. "They blamed me. Lord Harrington implied you were trying to manufacture scandal to secure your position in my household. Lord Waverley suggested I'd been unfortunately influenced by someone with a grudge against proper society." Callum downed half the brandy in one swallow. It was Lennox. He'd prepared them, fed them counter-arguments before I even presented our case. "So he is involved." "I think so, but I can't prove it. Not yet." He set down the glass, finally meeting her eyes. "Margot, I'm sorry. I thought if I presented the evidence properly, through the correct channels, they'd have to listen. I was wrong. You weren't wrong. You were privileged." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "You believed the system would work, because it's always worked for you. But it doesn't work for children in orphanages, or women with dead fathers, or anyone who doesn't have a title and a seat at Brooks's. I know that now. Do you?" Margot stepped closer, her frustration finally boiling over. "Because from where I'm standing, Callum, you just learned a lesson I've known my entire life. The powerful protect their own, always. And when someone like me tries to expose them, I don't just lose the argument, I lose everything." "You won't lose everything. I won't let that happen." "You can't promise that," her voice cracked. "You can't protect me from rumors or scandal or the fact that Lord Harrington just told everyone at Brooks's that I'm manipulating you, that I'm a woman with dubious motives who doesn't understand finance. Do you know what that means for my reputation, for any credibility I might have had?" Callum's jaw tightened. "Then we'll prove them wrong. We'll find absolute evidence against Lennox, expose him so thoroughly that no one can dismiss it. And in the meantime, we keep working. We don't let them silence us just because they're uncomfortable with the truth." Margot wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that courage and determination and doing the right thing would somehow be enough. But Cook's warning echoed in her head, mixing with the memory of her father dying in debtor's prison, while good men who'd promised to help him looked the other way. "I need to think," she said quietly. "I need to be alone." She left before he could respond, retreating to her locked rooms, where no one could see her cry, where no one could witness the moment she finally accepted what she'd been avoiding since that first confrontation on Brook Street. She'd made herself visible, and now she was going to pay the price. The campaign against Margot began subtly, a mention in a society column about the Duke of Greymont's unusual choice of companion for his reform work. A few pointed questions at Lady Pemberton's salon about whether it was appropriate for unmarried women to work so closely with unmarried men. Whispers that perhaps Miss Thorne's interest in the foundling hospitals had less to do with charity and more to do with securing her own future. Then it escalated. Someone, Margot suspected Lennox but couldn't prove it, started spreading detailed rumors about her father, about the debts he'd left, the shame of dying in prison, the daughter who'd been forced into service because no respectable man would marry her, about how she'd attached herself to the Duke of Greymont with calculated precision, using her knowledge and his guilt to manipulate her way into his household. Within a week, Margot couldn't leave her rooms without hearing whispers. Servants who'd been cordial turned cold. Invitations that had occasionally come her way, minor events, small gatherings, dried up completely. And through it all, Lord Percival Lennox smiled and offered sympathetic concern whenever he encountered Callum at their reform meetings. "Such a shame about Miss Thorne," he said one afternoon, his tone dripping false compassion. "I do hope the scandal doesn't damage your important work, Your Grace. Perhaps it would be wiser to continue the initiative with more appropriate assistance." Margot watched from across the room, cataloguing the way Lennox's eyes flicked to her with barely concealed satisfaction. He wanted her gone, needed her gone. Because as long as she was examining the financial records, asking uncomfortable questions, connecting patterns no one else bothered to notice, she was a threat to whatever scheme he was running. "Miss Thorne stays," Callum said flatly. "And I'll thank you not to speculate about her character, Lennox. Of course, Your Grace. I meant no offence." Lennox's smile never wavered. "I merely worry about appearances. You know how society can be." After he left, Callum turned to Margot with barely controlled fury. "He's doing this deliberately, manufacturing scandal to discredit you. I know. We need to move faster. Find proof of his embezzlement before he destroys your reputation completely. My reputation is already destroyed." Margot kept her voice steady, clinical. "The question is whether we can salvage the reform initiative." "Damn the initiative. I won't let him do this to you. You don't have a choice." She met his eyes, letting him see the exhaustion she'd been hiding. "This is how the world works, Callum. Powerful men protect themselves by destroying anyone who threatens them. Lennox is very good at it, and I'm an easy target." "You're not." "I am. I'm a woman with no family, no fortune, no protection except what you've given me. And the more you defend me, the more people assume I've seduced you into it." Margot straightened her shoulders. "Maybe Lennox is right. Maybe I should leave before this destroys everything you're trying to accomplish." Callum crossed the room in 3 strides, and suddenly he was close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Don't," he said, his voice rough. "Don't let him win. Don't let them make you invisible again. Being invisible kept me safe. Being invisible was killing you. I saw it that day on Brook Street. Saw the way you'd compressed yourself into something small and quiet and acceptable." His hands came up like he wanted to touch her, then fell away. "You were furious and brilliant and so desperate to be heard that you shouted at a stranger about blocking the street. That's who you are, Margot. Not this careful, defeated woman Lennox is trying to turn you into. That furious, brilliant woman is getting destroyed by rumors and scandal. Maybe she should have stayed quiet. If she had, dozens of children would still be sleeping in buildings with collapsing roofs and eating food contaminated by rats. Mrs. Crawford would still think she was failing. The embezzlement would continue unchecked." He did touch her then, just his fingers against her cheek, feather-light and devastating. "You matter, Margot. The work you're doing matters. Don't let Lennox take that away." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that mattering was worth the cost. But standing there with his hand against her face, feeling the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she stood to lose, Margot couldn't remember why she'd thought visibility was worth fighting for. "I need air," she whispered, pulling back. "I need to think." She fled to the garden before he could respond, before she could do something catastrophically stupid, like lean into his touch or believe that a duke could actually protect a woman like her from the machinery of social destruction. The garden was small, but carefully maintained, a pocket of green in the middle of Mayfair's stone and smoke. Margot sank onto a bench, letting the autumn chill seep through her dress, trying to remember how to breathe. She'd been so foolish. So desperately, impossibly foolish. She'd thought that doing good work would be enough, that exposing corruption and helping children would somehow shield her from the consequences of being visible. But the world didn't work that way. It never had. "Miss Thorne?" Margot looked up to find a young maid hovering nearby, her expression uncertain. "Yes? There's a woman at the servants' entrance asking for you. Says her name is Mrs. Crawford from St. Margaret's." Margot's heart lifted. "Send her in, please." Mrs. Crawford appeared moments later, looking uncomfortable and determined in equal measure. "Miss Thorne, forgive the intrusion, but I heard the rumors. The things people are saying about you. I'm sure you have." Margot tried to smile. "You needn't worry. It won't affect the reforms we've implemented." "That's not—" Mrs. Crawford sat down beside her, uninvited and unexpected. "That's not why I came. I came because those rumors are lies, and I won't stand by while people destroy a good woman for having the courage to help." Margot's throat tightened. "Mrs. Crawford, you saved lives, Miss Thorne. 3 children who would have died last winter are alive because you noticed the roof was leaking and insisted on repairs, because you examined our medical supplies and realized half of them were spoiled, because you cared enough to look past the paperwork and see the actual children." Mrs. Crawford's eyes were fierce. "So I don't care what Lord, whoever he is, says about your character. I know your character. I've seen it." "That's kind of you, but society doesn't care about the opinions of orphanage matrons." "Maybe they should." Mrs. Crawford stood, brushing off her skirts. "I'm going to write letters to every institution you've helped, every matron and physician and administrator who's seen your work. We may not have titles or influence, but we have the truth. And I think that should count for something." She left before Margot could respond, leaving her alone in the garden with tears streaming down her face and something fragile blooming in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. Mrs. Crawford's letters arrived like a small miracle. Within days, testimonials from orphanage staff across London began flooding into the Duke of Greymont's household. Matrons describing Margot's dedication and expertise. Physicians praising her medical knowledge and compassionate care, administrators detailing specific improvements she'd identified and implemented. It wasn't enough to silence the scandal. Gossip had momentum that facts couldn't easily overcome. But it created counter-narrative, a story where Margot Thorne wasn't a scheming seductress, but a woman doing genuinely important work. Callum had the letters compiled into a formal document and presented to the Reform Committee. Lennox's expression when he read them was worth every moment of humiliation Margot had endured. "While these testimonials are heartwarming," Lennox said carefully, "they don't address the fundamental impropriety of Miss Thorne's position in your household, Your Grace." "What impropriety?" Callum's voice was dangerously calm. "She's my employee. She works for me, just as my secretary works for me. My steward works for me. My valet works for me. Unless you're suggesting that all employment relationships between men and women are inherently improper." "Of course not, but—" "Then I fail to see the problem. Miss Thorne has professional expertise I require. She provides that expertise in exchange for fair compensation. That you and others have chosen to sexualize a professional relationship says far more about your assumptions than it does about her character." The room went silent. Margot, sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes as usual, felt something shift in her chest. Callum wasn't just defending her. He was publicly rejecting the entire framework that made women like her vulnerable to scandal. Lennox's smile tightened. Your Grace, I only meant... I know what you meant, and I'm telling you definitively that Miss Thorne's employment is not subject to committee approval or societal speculation. Callum stood, his posture radiating aristocratic authority. Now, shall we discuss the actual business of this meeting? Namely, the significant discrepancies in institutional funding that Miss Thorne has documented? He spent the next hour systematically presenting the evidence of embezzlement, forcing the committee to examine specific financial records, demanding explanations for funds that had mysteriously vanished between allocation and disbursement. Lennox tried to deflect, to minimize, to suggest the discrepancies were merely administrative errors. But with each excuse, Callum produced another document, another pattern, another piece of evidence that made coincidence increasingly impossible to believe. By the meeting's end, the committee had reluctantly agreed to commission an independent audit of all orphanage funding for the past 5 years. It wasn't the immediate justice Margot craved, but it was progress, real, tangible progress that Lennox couldn't simply dismiss. As the committee members filed out, Lennox paused beside Margot's chair. "You've made a powerful enemy, Miss Thorne," he said quietly, his pleasant mask slipping just enough to reveal the cold fury beneath. "I hope the Duke's protection is worth what it will cost you." "Is that a threat, Lord Lennox?" "Simply an observation." His smile returned, sharp as a blade. "Powerful protectors can be fickle, and women in your position have so very far to fall." He left before she could respond, but his words echoed in Margot's head for hours afterward. Because he was right. She'd made an enemy who controlled significant wealth and influence, who sat on boards and committees across London, who could destroy her with a word to the right people, and her only protection was Callum's willingness to defend her, which, as Lennox had so helpfully pointed out, could evaporate at any moment. That night, unable to sleep, Margot sat in her rooms, reviewing financial documents by candlelight. There had to be something concrete linking Lennox to the embezzlement, something undeniable that would... A knock at her door. Soft, hesitant. Margot opened it to find Callum standing in the hallway, still dressed despite the late hour. "I saw your light," he said. "You should be sleeping." "So should you." "I can't. Keep thinking about what Lennox said to you after the meeting." His eyes searched hers. "What did he say?" "Nothing important." "Margot." She sighed, stepping back to let him into her sitting room. "He warned me that powerful protectors can be fickle, that I have far to fall." She tried to smile. "Standard intimidation tactics. Nothing I can't handle." "I'm not fickle." Callum moved closer, his expression intense in the candlelight. "And I'm not going to abandon you to Lennox's revenge. Whatever happens, whatever he tries to do, you're not facing it alone. You can't promise that. I can, and I am." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "Margot, I need you to understand something. This stopped being just about reform work weeks ago. Stop being professional the moment you told me I was blocking the street and looked at me like you could see straight through every carefully constructed layer of aristocratic politeness to the person underneath." Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Callum, let me finish, please." His thumb traced circles on her palm, and she wondered if he could feel her pulse racing. "I've spent 33 years surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, who see the title and the wealth and treat me like I'm somehow more valuable than everyone else. You see me. Just me. The man who blocks streets and makes mistakes and needs to be told when he's wrong. That's not... I don't... You do. And it terrifies me how much I've come to depend on it. On you." He lifted her hand, pressed it against his chest where she could feel his heart beating just as fast as hers. "So when Lennox threatens you, he's not just threatening my employee or my reform initiative. He's threatening the person who makes me want to be better than I am." Margot couldn't breathe. couldn't think past the feeling of his heart under her palm and the way he was looking at her like she was something precious instead of scandalous. "This is dangerous," she managed. "If people knew you felt this way, let them know. Let them talk. I don't care anymore." His free hand came up to cup her face, and Margot's eyes fluttered closed. "I'm tired of pretending this is just professional. Tired of watching you suffer for helping me while I hide behind propriety and worry about appearances. Callum, if you—" Her voice broke. "Society will destroy me. Completely. I'll be ruined beyond any hope of recovery. Then I'll ruin myself with you." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I'll make sure everyone knows that you're not my mistress or my social climbing employee. That you're the woman I—" He stopped, pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. And Margot saw her own terrified hope reflected in his gaze. "The woman you what?" she whispered. "The woman I'm falling in love with." The words hung between them, impossible and devastating and more real than anything Margot had felt in years. She should pull away, should tell him this was madness, that love didn't protect women like her from the machinery of social destruction. Instead, she kissed him. It was brief, chaste, nothing like the passionate embraces she'd read about in novels. Just her lips against his, her hands still pressed to his racing heart, his breath catching with surprise and wonder. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark, with something that made her stomach flip. "Margot, don't!" She stepped away, putting necessary distance between them. "Don't say anything else. Not tonight. I need to think, to process what this means. What it means is that I love you, that I choose you, regardless of scandal or reputation or what Lennox threatens." His voice was steady, certain. "What it means is that you're not alone anymore." "I've always been alone, Callum, even when I didn't want to be." Margot wrapped her arms around herself. "Everyone I've ever depended on has either died or abandoned me when it became inconvenient to care. My father, my mother, every person who promised to help after Papa died and then vanished when they realized I came with debt and scandal. I'm not them. You're a duke. You can afford to love me right up until it threatens something you actually value. Your political career, your social standing, your reforms. The moment loving me costs you something real, you'll choose the thing that matters more." Tears burned behind her eyes. "And I'll be left with nothing again." Callum's expression shattered. "You honestly believe I'd do that to you? I believe people do what they have to do to survive. And you've never had to choose between love and survival." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Please go. Please let me think about this without you here, making me want things I can't afford to want." For a moment, she thought he'd argue, thought he'd push back with more declarations and promises she desperately wanted to believe. Instead, he simply nodded. "I'll go. But Margot, the offer stands. Everything I said tonight stands, whether you believe it or not." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Margot sank onto her bed with tears streaming down her face, because she wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love could be enough, that a duke could choose a nobody governess and face down society's judgment without flinching. But she'd learned too young and too harshly that wanting something didn't make it real, and loving someone didn't mean they'd stay when the world demanded they leave. The audit results arrived 3 weeks later, and they were damning. Over £70,000 had been systematically embezzled from London's foundling hospitals over the past 5 years. The money had been funneled through a complex network of shell companies and false contracts, all designed to hide the theft while maintaining the appearance of proper fund distribution. And every single false contract traced back to companies owned by Lord Percival Lennox. Callum presented the findings to the Reform Committee with barely controlled fury. "Gentlemen, we are looking at evidence of sustained, deliberate theft from some of London's most vulnerable children. The audit is thorough and conclusive. I'm calling for immediate legal action against Lord Lennox." The committee shifted uncomfortably. Lord Harrington cleared his throat. "Your Grace, these are serious accusations. Lord Lennox is a respected member of society. Lord Lennox is a thief who's been stealing from orphans." Callum's voice cut like ice. "The evidence is here. It's irrefutable. Unless you're suggesting we ignore documented financial crimes because the criminal has a title. Of course not, but we must be careful. Accusations of this nature can destroy reputations. Good. His reputation should be destroyed, along with his freedom." Callum gathered the audit documents. "I'm taking this to the magistrate today. Whether the committee supports legal action or not is irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself." He turned to leave, then paused. "And gentlemen, when this becomes public, and it will become public, I suggest you prepare explanations for why it took a governess with dubious motives to notice what you all somehow missed for years. I'm certain the newspapers will be very interested in that particular detail." Margot waited outside the committee room, her stomach churning. She'd reviewed the audit results a dozen times, knew the evidence was solid. But she also knew that powerful men facing exposure could be desperate, dangerous. Callum emerged looking grimly satisfied. "It's done. I'm meeting with the magistrate in an hour. Lennox will know by then. Someone on the committee will warn him. Let them. He can't run fast enough to escape this." Callum's hand found hers, squeezed gently. "We did it, Margot. We actually did it." She wanted to share his triumph, wanted to believe this was over, that justice would prevail, that exposing Lennox would be enough. But the cold weight in her stomach suggested otherwise. They discovered why that evening. Margot was reviewing correspondence in the library when she heard shouting from the entrance hall. She rushed out to find Callum arguing with a constable, his face pale with rage. "What do you mean, warrant for arrest? On what possible grounds?" "Theft, Your Grace. Lord Lennox has filed a complaint stating that Miss Margot Thorne stole confidential financial documents from his office and falsified evidence to frame him for embezzlement." The constable looked deeply uncomfortable. "I'm required to take her into custody pending investigation." The world tilted. Margot gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. "That's not... I never..." Of course she didn't. Callum stepped between her and the constable. "This is retaliation. Lord Lennox is trying to discredit the audit by accusing the person who discovered his crimes." "That may be, Your Grace, but I have a warrant signed by a magistrate. I have to execute it." "Which magistrate?" "Sir Bernard Wickham." Callum's expression turned murderous. "Wickham is Lennox's cousin. This entire thing is a farce designed to... Your Grace, I don't make the laws. I just enforce them." The constable looked at Margot with genuine sympathy. "Miss, I need you to come with me. She's not going anywhere without legal representation." Callum was already moving toward his study. "I'm sending for my solicitor immediately. Margot stays here until he arrives." "I can't allow that, Your Grace. The warrant can wait another hour while I ensure Miss Thorne has proper legal counsel." "Unless you're suggesting that accused persons don't deserve representation." The constable hesitated, clearly weighing the politics of arresting someone under the Duke of Greymont's protection against his legal obligation to execute the warrant. Margot made the decision for him. "It's all right," she said quietly, stepping forward. "I'll go. Callum, don't make this worse by interfering with a legal warrant." "Margot, no." "Yes." She met his eyes, letting him see the exhausted resignation she felt. "This is what Lennox does. He destroys people who threaten him by turning their own evidence against them. Fighting the constable won't help, but having your solicitor meet me at the magistrate's office might." She could see him wanting to argue, to use his title and influence to protect her from this newest horror. But they both knew that would only feed the narrative Lennox was constructing, the Duke so besotted with his mistress that he'd obstruct justice to save her. "Send for your solicitor," she repeated. "I'll be fine." It was a lie. They both knew it. But Callum nodded tightly and let the constable escort her from his house while servants whispered and witnesses gathered. The Duke's mistress, arrested for theft. The governess who'd seduced Greymont, finally exposed. The woman who dared to challenge Lord Lennox, learning the cost of ambition. Margot heard the whispers even as the constable helped her into the carriage with unexpected gentleness. Heard them and felt the last fragile threads of her reputation shredding completely. She'd wanted visibility, wanted to matter. Be careful what you wish for, her father used to say, because visibility, it turned out, just meant there were more people watching when you fell. The magistrate's office was exactly as grim as Margot expected. Sir Bernard Wickham sat behind an enormous desk, his expression a careful blend of sympathy and severity that didn't quite hide his satisfaction. Lennox stood to the side, playing the wounded party with practiced skill. "Miss Thorne," Wickham began, "you stand accused of theft of confidential documents and falsification of evidence. Lord Lennox alleges that you gained unauthorized access to his private office and stole financial records, which you then altered to implicate him in embezzlement. How do you plead?" "Not guilty." Margot kept her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. "I never entered Lord Lennox's office. All documents I reviewed were provided through official channels as part of the Duke of Greymont's reform initiative. And yet Lord Lennox has testimony from his staff placing you at his residence 3 weeks ago." "That's impossible. I've never been to Lord Lennox's residence." Lennox stepped forward, his expression sorrowful. "Miss Thorne, I understand you feel backed into a corner, but lying will only make this worse. My housekeeper clearly recalls admitting a woman matching your description who claimed to be delivering correspondence from the Duke. Then your housekeeper is mistaken or lying." Margot met his eyes, letting him see that she knew exactly what he was doing. "You've fabricated this entire accusation because the audit exposed your embezzlement." "Miss Thorne," Wickham's voice sharpened, "you will address Lord Lennox with proper respect." "Why? He's a thief who's stolen from orphaned children. He deserves no respect." The door burst open. Callum strode in with a distinguished older gentleman Margot recognized as London's most expensive solicitor. "Sir Bernard, I apologize for the interruption, but I must protest this proceeding." Callum's voice carried aristocratic authority that made even Wickham straighten. "You are Lord Lennox's cousin, which presents a clear conflict of interest in adjudicating charges he's brought. The family connection is distant and doesn't impact my ability to fairly evaluate, doesn't it? Because it seems remarkably convenient that the very day I present evidence of Lord Lennox's embezzlement to a magistrate, he files charges against my associate with you, his cousin, and obtains a warrant within hours." Wickham's face reddened. "Your Grace, I resent the implication." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Callum placed a document on the desk. "This is a formal complaint requesting your recusal due to conflict of interest. I've also requested that the Lord Chancellor review both the embezzlement evidence and these theft charges simultaneously." Margot saw Lennox's mask slip for just a moment, saw the flash of panic before he smoothed it away, because involving the Lord Chancellor meant taking this beyond London's interconnected web of favours and family connections. Meant subjecting everything to scrutiny that even someone as well-connected as Lennox couldn't easily manipulate. "That's unnecessary," Lennox said smoothly. "If Miss Thorne is innocent, as she claims, a simple investigation will clear her. There's no need to involve. There's every need." Callum's solicitor spoke for the first time, his voice dry as old paper. "My client's reputation has been damaged by these accusations. We insist on the most thorough and impartial investigation possible, unless Lord Lennox has some reason to fear additional scrutiny. The trap was beautifully laid. If Lennox backed down, he'd appear to be hiding something. If he pushed forward, he'd risk the Lord Chancellor discovering the extent of his embezzlement." Wickham looked between Callum and Lennox, clearly weighing competing loyalties. Finally, "Very well. I'll recuse myself and refer both matters to the Lord Chancellor's office. Miss Thorne will be released on her own recognizance pending investigation." "Absolutely not." Lennox's pleasant mask shattered completely. "She's a flight risk. She should be held—" "On what grounds?" The solicitor raised an eyebrow. "Miss Thorne is employed by the Duke of Greymont and resides in his household. She has no means to flee London, even if she wanted to. Unless you're suggesting His Grace would assist a criminal in evading justice. Of course not, but then I see no reason to detain her." Wickham's tone suggested he'd had enough of all of them. "Miss Thorne, you're released. Don't leave London." Margot nodded, not trusting her voice. The constable removed the chains from her wrists with an apologetic expression, and Callum's hand was immediately there, steadying her. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go home." They made it to the carriage before Margot's composure cracked. She collapsed against the seat, shaking with reaction and exhausted relief. "He almost won," she breathed. "If you hadn't gotten there when you did—" "But I did, and he didn't win." Callum pulled her against his chest, and Margot let herself sink into the warmth and solidity of him. "The Lord Chancellor's office will investigate thoroughly. They'll see through Lennox's fabrications. Will they, or will they see a nobody governess accused of theft and decide the easiest solution is to convict me and make the whole mess disappear? They'll see the truth. I won't let them ignore it." Margot pulled back enough to look at him. "You can't promise that. You can't control how powerful men decide to resolve uncomfortable situations." "No, but I can make it so uncomfortable that ignoring it becomes impossible." His expression was fierce in the dim carriage light. "Margot, I'm going public with all of it. The embezzlement, Lennox's accusations, everything. I'm taking it to the newspapers tomorrow. That will destroy any chance of what? Quiet resolution, discreet handling? I don't want quiet anymore. I want everyone in London to know exactly what Lennox did and exactly why he's trying to destroy you for exposing it. It could damage your reforms, your political future, everything you've worked for. Then I'll rebuild. But I won't do it by protecting Lennox or sacrificing you to society's convenience." He cupped her face gently. "I meant what I said before. I choose you, whatever that costs." Margot wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that a duke's choice could actually protect a woman like her from the machinery grinding toward her destruction. But she'd learned too well that the world didn't care about intentions or love or choosing the right thing. It cared about power and propriety and making examples of women who forgot their place. Still, sitting in Callum's arms while London rattled past outside, Margot let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might feel like if he was right. If choosing each other could actually be enough, even though she knew with bone-deep certainty that the hardest battle was still ahead. The newspapers exploded with the story the next morning. Duke exposes massive orphanage embezzlement scheme. Lord Lennox accused of stealing $70,000 from London's foundling hospital's governess or heroine. The woman who uncovered society's darkest secret. Callum had given them everything. The audit results, the testimonials from orphanage staff, the pattern of Lennox's theft. He'd framed Margot not as his mistress or his employee, but as the person whose expertise and dedication had exposed a crime everyone else had missed. It was brilliant, devastating, completely unprecedented for a duke to publicly defend a woman of Margot's station. It also painted an enormous target on both their backs. The backlash was immediate. Half of London's aristocracy rallied behind Lennox, declaring the charges ridiculous and the evidence manufactured. The other half divided between those genuinely horrified by the embezzlement and those who saw political opportunity in a scandal this large. And through it all, the question everyone kept asking, what exactly was Miss Margot Thorne's relationship with the Duke of Greymont? The speculation reached new heights of absurdity. She was his mistress, his illegitimate half-sister, a French spy using orphanage reform as cover, a brilliant mathematician who'd cracked an unbreakable code, a fortune hunter who'd seduced a duke for his wealth. Every theory treated her as something scandalous, extraordinary, anything except what she actually was. A woman who'd noticed patterns in financial records and cared enough to investigate. "You need to make a statement," Callum's solicitor advised during an emergency strategy meeting. "Clarify your relationship publicly before the speculation does more damage." "No." Margot's voice was firm. "The moment I start defending my character, I've already lost. They'll pick apart every word, find new reasons to doubt me. Then what do you suggest? Let the evidence speak for itself. The audit is thorough. Lennox's guilt is documented. Keep the focus there instead of on me." The solicitor looked skeptical but nodded. "We'll need character witnesses, people who can testify to your expertise and credibility. I'll provide them." Mrs. Crawford's voice came from the doorway. Margot turned to find the matron standing there with a dozen other women, matrons, teachers, nurses from every institution Margot had helped. "We'll all testify. Every one of us will tell the Lord Chancellor's investigator exactly what Miss Thorne did for our children." Margot's throat closed. "You don't have to do this. Testifying could damage your own positions. Let it." Mrs. Crawford stepped forward, her expression fierce. "You risked everything to help children no one else cared about. The least we can do is tell the truth about that. About you." Over the next week, the Lord Chancellor's office conducted the most thorough investigation Margot had ever witnessed. They interviewed orphanage staff, reviewed financial records, examined every document related to both the embezzlement charges and Lennox's accusations against her. Callum was questioned for 6 hours about his relationship with Margot, whether he'd instructed her to steal documents, whether his judgment had been compromised by inappropriate feelings. He apparently told them exactly what those feelings were. The report, when it finally came, was definitive. The embezzlement charges against Lord Percival Lennox were substantiated by overwhelming evidence. He would face criminal prosecution. The theft charges against Miss Margot Thorne were without merit and appeared to be retaliatory. All accusations were dismissed. It should have been a triumph, complete vindication, justice served. Instead, it was complicated, because the report also included a footnote. "We note with concern the Duke of Greymont's admitted romantic attachment to Miss Thorne and recommend that future reform initiatives maintain more appropriate professional boundaries to avoid appearance of impropriety." In other words, you were right, but you're still scandalous. Lennox is guilty, but the Duke loving you is inappropriate. Margot read the footnote 3 times, feeling something cold settle in her chest. They'd won the legal battle and lost the social war. Lennox would go to prison, but she'd remain the woman who'd seduced a duke and needed to be carefully managed. "It doesn't matter," Callum said when she showed him the report. "Lennox is finished. The reforms will continue. And what the Lord Chancellor thinks about my romantic attachments is, frankly, none of his concern." "Callum, this footnote is a warning. They're saying your political credibility is damaged by your association with me. Then I'll rebuild my credibility, or I won't, but I'm not giving you up to satisfy some bureaucrat's idea of appropriate boundaries. You might have to." Margot set down the report carefully. "If you want your reforms to actually succeed, if you want to keep doing this work without constant speculation about your motives, I want you." He crossed to her, taking her hands. "I want you more than I want political convenience or social approval or any of it. Can you understand that?" "I understand you think you do, but Callum, us, it's built on crisis and intensity and proximity. When things calm down, when the scandal fades, you might feel differently. I won't. You can't know that. I know that I've never felt this way about anyone. Know that I'd rather face scandal with you than propriety without you. Know that watching you fight for children nobody else valued made me fall in love with you." His voice softened. "And I know you feel something too. Saw it when you kissed me. Feel it every time you look at me like I'm the only person in the room who matters." Margot's defenses crumbled. "Of course I feel something. I feel God. I feel everything. But feeling something doesn't mean acting on it is wise. Since when has wisdom mattered more than truth? Since the moment I became visible enough to be destroyed by it." She pulled her hands free, wrapping her arms around herself. "Callum, I can't be the reason your work fails. Can't be the scandal that undermines everything you're trying to accomplish. I've fought too hard for these reforms to watch them collapse, because people can't stop speculating about whether we're lovers. Then let's give them something they can't speculate about." He dropped to one knee before she could process what was happening. "Marry me!" The world stopped. Margot stared at him, at this impossible man kneeling in his library, offering her something she'd never dared imagine. "You're insane," she breathed. "Probably. But I'm also serious. Marry me, Margot, not to silence scandal or legitimize our working relationship or any practical reason. Marry me because I love you, and I want to spend my life with someone who'll tell me when I'm blocking the street. You're a duke. You're supposed to marry, I don't know, a duke's daughter or an heiress or someone appropriate. I'd rather marry someone inappropriate who makes me want to be better." His eyes searched hers. "Say yes. Please say yes." Margot wanted to. Wanted it with every fiber of her being. But she also saw the future stretching ahead, the whispers, the speculation, the constant questions about whether she'd trapped him or seduced him, or manipulated her way into a position she didn't deserve. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "the scandal gets worse. People will say I planned this from the beginning, that I manufactured the entire orphanage investigation to secure a proposal. Let them. Your political allies will abandon you. Your reforms might stall. Everything you've worked for could—" "Margot," he stood, framing her face with his hands. "Listen to me. The work matters, the reforms matter, but you matter more. You will always matter more. And if I have to choose between social approval and you, I choose you, every single time." She was crying now, hot tears sliding down her cheeks while he looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. "I'm terrified," she whispered. "So am I. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you." It was the most foolish, reckless, impossible thing she'd ever considered. Marrying a duke, becoming a duchess, making herself permanently visible in a world that wanted women like her to disappear. But Margot Thorne had stopped being sensible the moment she'd shouted at a stranger about blocking the street, had stopped protecting herself the moment she'd agreed to help with reforms that would make her a target. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid and start being brave. "Yes," she said, and watched his face transform with joy. "Yes, I'll marry you, even though you're completely insane, and this will probably destroy both our reputations." He kissed her then. Not chaste, not careful, but with the kind of passion that made her forget every reason this was a terrible idea. Made her forget the whispers and the warnings and the certainty that the world would punish them for choosing each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Callum rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he murmured, "for being brave enough to say yes. Thank you for being foolish enough to ask." They stood there in the library while London carried on outside, two people who'd chosen each other despite every reason not to, who'd decided that love and truth and doing right mattered more than propriety or safety or all the careful compromises that kept you invisible. It wouldn't be easy. Margot knew that. The scandal would intensify. People would question their marriage. Some of Callum's political allies might desert him. But they'd also saved dozens of children, exposed massive corruption, changed policies that would protect vulnerable people for years to come. And they'd done it together. Whatever came next, at least they'd face it together. That had to count for something. The wedding was scheduled for 6 weeks later, which gave London society exactly enough time to lose their collective minds. The Duke of Greymont marrying a governess. Unprecedented, scandalous, either the most romantic gesture of the century or proof that Miss Thorne had indeed trapped him. Margot tried to ignore the speculation, focusing instead on the continued investigation into Lennox's embezzlement. The trial was set for early December, and the prosecutors wanted her testimony about discovering the financial irregularities. "You'll be brilliant," Callum assured her the night before her court appearance. "Just tell the truth exactly as you experienced it. And if the defense tries to suggest I'm biased, that I manipulated evidence to benefit you, then you tell them that evidence doesn't manipulate. Numbers either add up or they don't. And Lennox's numbers definitively don't." He was right. The next morning, standing in the witness box while Lennox's expensive barrister tried to discredit her, Margot kept her answers simple and factual. Yes, she'd reviewed the financial records. Yes, she'd noticed the discrepancies. Yes, she'd brought them to the Duke's attention because that was her job. "And isn't it convenient, Miss Thorne, that these discoveries led to your engagement to the Duke?" The barrister's tone dripped skepticism. "I don't see what's convenient about having my character questioned by someone defending a man who stole from orphaned children," Margot replied calmly. "The financial evidence is documented and independently verified. Whether I marry the Duke or not doesn't change the fact that Lord Lennox embezzled £70,000, the gallery murmured. The barrister tried a few more angles, but Margot simply kept redirecting to the evidence, to the numbers that told their own damning story. When Mrs. Crawford testified later that day, her voice shaking but determined, describing how children had suffered because funds meant for them had disappeared, even the most skeptical observers looked uncomfortable. The trial lasted 3 days. The verdict took the jury less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Lord Percival Lennox was sentenced to 15 years in prison and ordered to repay the full £70,000 plus damages. It was justice, real, tangible justice. The kind that didn't usually happen when powerful men committed crimes. Margot stood in the courtroom gallery next to Callum, watching Lennox being led away, and felt something hard and bitter inside her chest finally begin to dissolve. They'd done it. Despite the scandal and the threats and everyone telling them it was impossible, they'd actually held a powerful man accountable for harming vulnerable people. "How does it feel?" Callum murmured. "Like we won. Finally won. We did." He squeezed her hand. "And now we get to keep winning, keep reforming these institutions, helping these children, making sure what Lennox did never happens again. As Duke and Duchess, as partners, which is what we've always been." That evening, Callum hosted a dinner for all the orphanage staff who'd testified. Hook prepared an enormous meal, and the Duke of Greymont's formal dining room filled with matrons and nurses and teachers who'd probably never imagined being invited to an aristocratic table. Mrs. Crawford gave an impromptu toast. "To Miss Thorne, soon to be Her Grace, who saw us when no one else bothered to look, who fought for children who couldn't fight for themselves, who proved that courage matters more than courtesy and truth matters more than titles." Margot's eyes burned with tears. "I couldn't have done any of this without all of you. You're the ones who do the real work day after day, with insufficient resources and no recognition. I just noticed what you'd been trying to tell people for years." "You noticed," Mrs. Crawford agreed, "and then you acted. That's what made the difference." Later, after the guests had left and the house had quieted, Margot found herself in the garden where Mrs. Crawford had first come to defend her. Where she'd first started believing that visibility might be worth the cost, Callum joined her on the bench, wrapping his coat around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Nervous about the wedding?" he asked. "Terrified, not of marrying you, but of everything else. The scrutiny, the expectations, becoming a duchess when I barely managed being a governess. You were an excellent governess. I was invisible, which made it easy." She leaned against him. "Callum, what if I'm terrible at this? What if I can't navigate society politics or remember proper protocols or—" "Then you'll be terrible at it, and I'll love you anyway." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Margot, I'm not marrying you because I need a perfect duchess. I'm marrying you because you make me want to be better than I am, because you see the world's injustices and refuse to accept them, because you blocked my carriage that day instead of staying silent." "I didn't block your carriage. You blocked the street." "Exactly, and you told me so, in front of everyone. That's who you are. That's who I want standing beside me for the rest of my life." Margot twisted to look at him properly. "I do love you. I don't think I've said that clearly enough, but I do. Desperately. I know. I've known since you kissed me and then tried to convince yourself it was a mistake." His smile was soft in the moonlight. "You're not good at hiding your feelings, for someone who spent 8 years being invisible. Apparently I'm not good at being invisible anymore either." "Good. The world needs to see you, needs what you have to offer." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, wrapped in each other's warmth, while London murmured beyond the garden walls. Finally, Margot said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me. For choosing me. For being foolish enough to propose to a woman who shouted at you in the street. Thank you for being brave enough to shout, and brave enough to say yes." He tilted her chin up, kissed her slowly. "Everything else, the wedding, the title, the expectations, we'll figure out together, one day at a time. One scandal at a time. Preferably fewer scandals, but if necessary, yes." Margot laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. They'd won. Against Lennox, against the system, against everyone who'd said a governess and a duke couldn't possibly matter to each other. They'd won, and now they got to keep winning. Keep fighting for children who needed protection. Keep pushing for reforms that powerful people wanted to ignore. Keep choosing each other, even when it was difficult. She could do this. Could be a duchess who told dukes when they were wrong. Could be visible and powerful and still herself, because she'd never been invisible. Not really. She'd just been waiting for someone to finally look. The wedding took place on a cold December morning at St. George's, Hanover Square, because Callum had insisted on a proper society wedding despite Margot's preference for something small and private. "If we're going to scandalize them anyway," he'd said, "we might as well do it spectacularly." Margot wore her mother's pearls, the only thing of value her father hadn't sold, and a dress that cost more than she'd earned in 2 years as a governess. She felt ridiculous and beautiful, and terrified in equal measure. The church filled with an odd mix of aristocracy and orphanage staff, duke and matrons, political allies, and the children they'd helped. Mrs. Crawford sat in the front row next to Lady Cordelia, both women crying openly. Callum waited at the altar in his formal attire, and when Margot walked down the aisle without a father to give her away, his expression made her forget every whispered speculation about whether this marriage was appropriate. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered. The ceremony was traditional, the vows standard. But when Callum spoke his promises to love, honor, cherish, Margot heard what he wasn't saying. "I choose you. I see you. You matter." And when it was her turn, when she promised to love him in sickness and health, for better or worse, she meant, "I trust you. I'll fight beside you. We'll keep winning together." The kiss was chaste by necessity. This was, after all, a church ceremony with half of London's elite watching. But Callum's hand trembled slightly against her cheek, and Margot knew he felt the same overwhelming mixture of joy and terror and absolute certainty. They were married, a duke and a former governess. The most scandalous match of the season. The reception afterward was elegant chaos. Aristocrats who'd questioned the marriage found themselves seated next to orphanage staff who'd testified at Lennox's trial. Politicians debated reform policies with nurses who'd implemented them. The usual rigid social boundaries blurred into something messier and more real. Mrs. Crawford cornered Margot during dinner. "Your Grace," she said, testing out the title with obvious delight. "I have a question about the new medical protocols we're implementing at St. Margaret's." And just like that, Margot stopped being a bride and became a partner in reform again. Spent the next hour discussing sanitation improvements and supply chains while her new husband charmed aristocratic donors into funding orphanage expansions. It wasn't romantic, wasn't the fairy tale wedding night society probably expected. It was perfect. Later, much later, when the guests had finally departed and they were alone in Callum's, their rooms, he pulled her close and murmured, "Still terrified?" "Absolutely. You?" "Completely." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "But also happier than I've ever been. Is that strange?" "If it is, we're both strange together." They stayed up talking until dawn, wrapped in each other and the extraordinary reality of what they'd done. Married, chosen each other publicly, irrevocably, in front of everyone who'd said it was impossible. "What happens now?" Margot asked as pale light began filtering through the windows. "Now we keep working, keep reforming institutions, helping children, driving the powerful people insane with our inconvenient questions." Callum's smile was sleepy and content. "And we do it together, as Duke and Duchess, as partners. Some people will never accept it. Never accept me. Their loss. They'll miss knowing the most remarkable woman in London because they're too busy worrying about propriety." Margot kissed him, slow and sweet. "I love you, even when you're being ridiculously optimistic. I love you. Especially when you're being appropriately cynical." They fell asleep, tangled together, as the city woke around them. Two people who'd refused to accept that the world was fixed and unchangeable, who'd fought for justice even when it cost them everything, who'd chosen love over safety and truth over silence. The scandal never fully disappeared. There would always be people who whispered about the governess who'd seduced a duke, who questioned whether Margot deserved her position, who suggested that the reforms were somehow tainted by the impropriety of their marriage. But there would also be children sleeping in safer buildings, eating uncontaminated food, receiving proper medical care because Margot had noticed what everyone else ignored. There would be orphanage staff who knew their concerns mattered, who had advocates willing to listen. There would be precedent for holding powerful people accountable when they stole from the vulnerable. And there would be one woman who'd learned that being invisible might be safer, but being seen, truly seen, was worth every moment of fear. 6 months after Lord Percival Lennox was sentenced to 15 years in prison, the Orphanage Reform Act passed the House of Lords by a margin of 12 votes. Margot stood in the gallery, watching Callum deliver his closing remarks, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel during the long months of fighting, hope that it would actually last. Mandatory independent audits, criminal penalties for embezzlement, oversight boards that included medical professionals and institution staff, not just aristocrats collecting titles. It was written into law now, permanent and enforceable. That evening they returned to St. Margaret's, not as investigators, but as witnesses to what change actually looked like. The new roof kept the rain out completely. The kitchen gleamed with proper equipment and rat-free storage. 30 children slept in beds that didn't crowd together, under blankets thick enough to keep them warm through winter. Mrs. Crawford met them at the door, her eyes bright. "Your Graces, come see." The medical supplies arrived this morning, and Dr. Morrison says we finally have everything we need. Margot toured the small infirmary, seeing shelves stocked with clean bandages, proper medicines, surgical tools that weren't rusted or broken. Seeing the tangible proof that their work had mattered. A small girl, maybe 7, approached shyly. "Miss Thorne, Your Grace." "You can call me Miss Thorne if you'd like," Margot said gently. "Mrs. Crawford says you're why we have the new roof. Why I don't get sick anymore when it rains." Margot's throat tightened. "Mrs. Crawford is why you're taken care of every single day. I just helped make sure she had what she needed to do it." "But you noticed." The girl's voice was solemn, wise beyond her years. "Mrs. Crawford says most people don't notice children like us, but you did." After the girl skipped away, Margot found Callum watching her with that expression that still made her heart skip, the one that said she was exactly who he'd been waiting for his entire life. "You're crying again," he observed. "I'm allowed to cry. We won." She gestured at the clean, safe building around them. "We actually won." "We did. And tomorrow we'll start on the next fight." He pulled her close, right there in the middle of St. Margaret's with staff and children watching. "I received a letter from the Home Office. They want to discuss expanding the reforms to workhouses. That's going to be even harder than the orphanages. Good thing I have you then." Margot looked around at the children, who were healthy and safe, at Mrs. Crawford beaming with pride, at the proof that invisible women could become impossible to ignore when they refused to stay silent. She thought about the governess she'd been, afraid, small, convinced that survival meant disappearing. She thought about the Duchess she'd become, still afraid, but brave enough to be visible anyway. "Callum," she said quietly, "do you remember what you said that day on Brook Street, after I shouted at you? I said many things, most of them insufferably arrogant. You asked what I knew about men like you." She turned in his arms, meeting his eyes. "I told you I knew you'd never gone hungry. Never worried about survival. Never stood in the rain wondering if you mattered. I remember. I was wrong. Not about your privilege, that was accurate, but about what you understood." She touched his face gently. "You saw me when I was invisible, chose me when it cost you everything, fought beside me when it would have been easier to let me fall. You understood what mattered more than I gave you credit for. You taught me what mattered. You still do, every single day." They stayed at St. Margaret's until the children went to bed, making plans for the workhouse reforms and the dozen other fights still ahead. The work would never be finished. There would always be more corruption to expose, more vulnerable people who needed someone to notice them. But standing there in a building they'd helped make safe, surrounded by children who would grow up healthy because 2 people had refused to accept that suffering was inevitable, Margot finally understood what her father had tried to tell her before he died. One person noticing, one person caring, one person refusing to stay silent, it could change everything. She was never beneath anyone. Not the aristocrats who'd dismissed her, not the society that had judged her, not even the duke she'd married. She'd always been exactly enough. She just needed to believe it. And now, with Callum beside her and decades of reform work ahead, she finally did. If you stayed until the end, thank you. Margot's story is about finding your voice when the world wants you silent and the courage it takes to be seen. We'd love to hear how this resonated with you. Drop a comment with your favorite moment or just let us know it touched your heart. Subscribe and ring the bell for more historical romances featuring unlikely loves and brave heroines. Your next story is waiting. Thank you for being here. You're exactly why we create these stories, because everyone deserves to feel seen, chosen and valued, just like Margot, just like you.